So a price ceiling is when a policy intervention comes in, which means you can't sell a good above that price. So let's start with our basic demand and supply diagram. Left axis is price, and this axis is quantity. We have a downward sloping demand curve, and we have an upward sloping supply curve. We can make some assumptions about these points that intersect, so we could assume this is $10, and we can assume this is $1. So we have an equilibrium point in the middle here, which is when supply equals demand. And we can just assume that that occurs when the price is $5, and at that price, the demanded quantity is 10 units. So what happens when you introduce a price ceiling? So a price ceiling means that the price cannot go above that price. So we need to put this below the equilibrium price in order for it to be effective, because otherwise the price would just be at equilibrium. So it's a bit counterintuitive on these diagrams because the price ceiling goes below the equilibrium price and the price floor goes above the equilibrium price, because otherwise the price would just sit at the equilibrium price. So let's introduce our price ceiling. So let's assume that this price ceiling comes in at $3. Now, what happens at this price? Well, the quantity supplied is here, and we can assume that's, say, 5 units. And the quantity demanded sits over here. And let's say that's 14 units. So in this scenario, and when you do this in an exam, I recommend you use a ruler to avoid these ginky lines. So what happens here? At $3, firms are only willing to supply 5 units, but consumers are demanding 14 units. So unfortunately, some consumers are just going to miss out. Firms are not going to produce enough to meet this demand because there's no incentive to do so. They can't charge higher prices, so they just supply here at the $3 price ceiling. So this might lead to things like queues or consumers just missing out. Now we can label this again, awful label, but hopefully you can do better. We can label this excess demand. So the market is transacting at this point here. Now the next question you might ask is, well, what does that mean for producer and consumer surplus? Great question. I'm glad you asked. So normally you'll remember that when the market is at equilibrium, the consumer surplus is everything below the demand line and the price here. So this triangle in here is the consumer surplus. Why is that? Well, it's because some consumers are willing to pay $10. Down here, there's a couple of units demanded, but they only have to pay $5. So they gain this whole area, right? And same for producers. It's this triangle on above the supply curve, but below that equilibrium price. This whole triangle is the producer surplus. Okay, but we're not transacting at this point in this market. We are transacting here because we have a price ceiling. So what does that mean first off for the producers? The producer surplus becomes this area above the supply curve, but below that price ceiling. So you can see that triangle has gotten smaller because of this policy. And what about consumers, I hear you ask? Well, great question. In order to do them, we just draw a line up from that price intersection, and this whole area now is the consumer surplus. So you can see that consumers have lost this little triangle in here, but they've gained this whole rectangle in here. Now, of course, in more advanced lessons, you will be able to calculate these areas. You can calculate a triangle as half its base times its height, and you can calculate a rectangle as base times height. So we can work all this out basically from the numbers we've put on this graph, and we could actually calculate the difference. But for the purposes of this video, we can safely assume that consumers have gained more than they've lost in this little bit, but producers have also lost more than the consumers have gained. And why is that? Well, it's because of this area here, which has become dead weight loss. Now that's just a loss to society in general. No one gets that anymore. It's just evaporated in terms of economic utility or economic function, it's gone. No one gets it. So society as a whole is worse off because of this policy, even though consumers appear to be winning. So as a result of this, we can say that social surplus has actually decreased. I hope that's helpful and a useful rundown of price ceilings. If you like this video, make sure you check out my others, hit like and subscribe, or drop a comment below if you've got any specific questions. I'll see you next time.